Good day. My name is Dr. Verena Gounden. I am currently a pathologist in the Department of Chemical Pathology at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and the Inkosi Luthuli Hospital in Durban, KZN. Today, I would like to go through some of my personal tips and experiences with regards to preparing for the FCPath exam, and I hope you'll find it helpful. First, I'm going to tackle the topic of study materials. It is often difficult and particularly overwhelming with the great volume of material that needs to be covered from preventing yourself from wanting to go through every textbook and journal out there. And we become overwhelmed by these choices. My best advice is to find a few key textbooks which you enjoy working with, and then work from these as your base. The four books that I found helpful during my time as a registrar, and which I still use routinely in everyday work. Let's start with some of the more basic textbooks, which you should go through during your first 6 months of the registrarship. Marshall's Clinical Chemistry provides a good background and basis for many of the chemical pathology topics that you would need to cover during your time as a registrar. Lippincott provides basic medical biochemistry and is basically a primer of lots of the things that you may have covered in med school but have forgotten. Worms in White is another very helpful book. It has a lot of case studies illustrating basic concepts in chemical pathology. Unfortunately, the book is currently out of print, but it's still a very useful book for the basics. Bishop's Clinical Chemistry is more of an intermediate book, but lots of people find it helpful. With regards to methods, I preferred to use Kaplan's Clinical Chemistry. I just found that the methods were more simply and easily to understand as described in Kaplan as compared to Teets. With regards to the meat of what your study material composed of in terms of books, Teets textbook of clinical chemistry and molecular diagnostics forms that. Personally, I didn't feel I should go through both fundamentals and the big Teets, since fundamentals is merely a abbreviated version of the big Teets, and I just didn't want to waste time going through two different books that had the same content, essentially. Additionally, I found it very helpful to go through the medical textbook Harrison's, especially to get a good background of various diseases. Harrison's describes pathophysiology very well. It's an easy to read and understand book. It has lots of illustrations and diagrams, and it's in color, which makes it very user-friendly. Another book that I found useful, but more as a reference, was Greenspan's Basic and Clinical Endocrinology. An interesting book that I used while studying for my American Board of Clinical Chemistry exams was by Clark, called Contemporary Practice in Clinical Chemistry, and that had a summary of basically all the major topics in chemical pathology, including management topics and worked calculations. So it was a very good book to prepare yourself for an exam. In terms of other study materials that I used, often you'd find that Teets and Kaplan and other sort of standard textbooks don't have enough information with regards to pediatric aspect of chemical pathology. So I also used the following books: Solden's Biochemical and Molecular Basis of Pediatric Disease, and for inborn errors of metabolism, I found the book by Soderbergh et al. To be very, very helpful, easy to understand, gave presented the information in a way that was easily remembered, and gave lots of approaches to conditions and inborn errors of metabolism, which made it easier to integrate the information. With regards to case studies, there have case study books that are available. Walmsley's Cases in Chemical Pathology being one. Marshall also has a book called Clinical Cases in Laboratory Medicine. Often you find in some textbooks, including the small Marshall, Walmsley and White, there are cases in those books as well. With regards to journals, I found that for me it was best just to concentrate on reviews, editorials, and case studies. I didn't bother much with original research articles in terms of preparing for studying for the FCP exams. I didn't think they were important in that aspect. With regards to the journals I used, I found my favorite journal to use for studying purposes was the Australian published journal, Clinical Biochemist Reviews. So this is a journal that's published 4 times a year, quarterly. It's basically a journal of reviews that covers current and topical issues in chemical pathology. The articles, the reviews are short and concise. They're very easy to understand, and provide excellent summaries for various topics in clinical chemistry. In addition, this journal is available freely. The other good journal that I like to study from or use for study material was Annals of Clinical Biochemistry. Again, they had very good reviews. The Canadian journal Clinical Biochemistry, obviously ClinChem, Clinica Chemica Acta, Journal of Clinical Pathology. All of these journals are good for reviews. Lab Medicine is an interesting journal. They often have lots of management topics, and these may be useful for studying for that aspect of clinical chemistry exams. Clinics. I found the clinics in Northern American clinics in laboratory medicine and endocrinology and metabolism very helpful. They consist of reviews on various on different issues. So each volume of that journal would be a different topic, such as investigation of liver disease or investigation of thyroid disease and such. Again, the big journals, like the big medical journals like Lancet, BMJ, and NEJM, they're useful for reviews, especially for Lancet's clinical seminars. I found to be very helpful. The other thing that you should always also remember is that lots of this information is often found in electronic media. So the AACC website has a newsletter called ClinLab News, and it provides sort of abbreviated summaries of different topics in chemical pathology that are currently hot topics or in the literature. I would advise everyone to become members of the Clinical Chemistry Training Council. This is free, and it will allow you access to a number of their resources, including Pearls in Laboratory Medicine, which is another useful and valuable resource. The AACC has a YouTube channel which you can subscribe to for free if you're a member of the Clinical Chemistry Training Council, and that together with Mayo Medical Lab's Hot Topics, they are both in a seminar or short lecture format, and you can watch these online. So this is when you are sort of tired of sitting and reading for hours and hours on end. It gives you sort of a break from that monotony. You can watch it while you cooking or listen to it in the car, and hope that some of the information often does get subliminally transmitted. The ACB newsletter is also another valuable source of information. They have the Deacon's Challenge calculations. Often they have essay questions where they go through the answers to essay questions. So it helps you in constructing your own summaries. The RCPA website, this is the Australian one. They have lots of past year papers and other helpful little snippets in terms of their training program and lectures and seminars that they've had. But unfortunately, I think that site needs you to be a member. So in terms of how the department that I worked in contributed to my knowledge, so I began my registrarship at WITS, and I spent the time there from 2006 until 2009 when I wrote my FCPA exams. So each department has a slightly different structure in terms of the ChemPath program, but more similarities than not. So for the first part, we also had received lectures in molecular medicine, which were very helpful, and I found that it enabled us to, me and myself in particular, to actually be introduced to the subject, which would become very much a hot topic in chemistry and ChemPath. Again, we had tutorials initially on joining the department, and directed tutorials for exam preparation the closer we got to our first part and to our second part. There were journal clubs which we participated in with other members of the academic staff. I think another way that you are able to learn and go through your ChemPath work is by student teaching and facilitation, as well as giving student lectures. And here you are forced to prepare for the lecture and forced to prepare for the tutorial session that you're doing, because you want to be able to answer the students' questions and seem knowledgeable to them. So you're forced to study the material, and even though it may not be on exactly the same level that you are expected to know it as a pathologist versus a medical student, it still helps you prepare and learn. Calculations. So we were given calculations on a regular basis to go through by ourselves, and the answers were discussed with us, so that we could learn from our errors. Case discussion was important, so it usually was informal, where we would bring up a case, an interesting case, to one of our pathologists. There'd be discussion around it, further reading around the topic, and this actually stimulates a lot of learning. It's often when you assign a patient case to a topic that you remember it better. The other thing that was good about the department that I worked in is that because it was a very big department with lots of registrars, lots of clinical contact, we had a day ward, we got a lot of exposure to the different aspects of chemical pathology that smaller institutes may not necessarily have. In terms of how senior colleagues contributed to my eventual passing of the exams and how did they assist me during my registrarship. So as I mentioned, we had formal teaching, but there was also a lot of informal teaching that went on. So I would bring up a case or a result that I wasn't sure about setting off, and then there would be discussion around that, follow-up of that, and it was a learning exercise in itself. Assisting the pathologist with validations, although it was a task that had to be done in terms of the lab, it was also a learning process for the registrar involved. Again, I mentioned the day-to-day discussion and also guidance on their exam experiences. It's always good to talk to people that have been through the process, because you can always pick up some pearls of wisdom from people that have been through it. In terms of who else I consulted, so I often talk to colleagues in other institutions, try to find out what's happening in their labs, look to their seminar timetables to see what topics they are covering and discussing, to make sure that I also cover those topics as well, in case my department hasn't highlighted it as a seminar topic. Also know what tests are performed in other labs. There's certain things that you may never ever see in your lab but come to the FCP exams, and it may be appearing in your OSPE. So know what other tests are run in labs apart from the one that you work in. And it may be worth your while to consider short visits for a week or two to other institutes, just to sort of see what happens and look at the processes there in other labs. What I would advise is that you partner up with another reg that will be writing close to the time that you would be writing. Studying is a lonely business, and it's good to feel that you're not going through this whole process alone. And even if you just communicate via telephone or email, asking each other what topics have you covered in the tutorial, what practicals are you doing, and so forth, it's helpful. In terms of how much time I spent studying, actual studying in the lab. So the way I look at it is that everything you do in the laboratory that is work related is a learning opportunity. So you read around the cases that you're signing out. If you don't understand something in journal club, you read around that topic, or if something sparks your interest in journal club, you read around the topic. You read around the assay methods when you're trying to troubleshoot the IQC, or if you're investigating a strange result or an unexpected result or a possible interference. Admittedly, in my first and second year, I did very little directed studying, except for the 2 or 3 weeks that I spent studying for my first part exams. Most of the time I spent focused on making summaries. So I made a list of all the topics that need to be covered, and this I would advise you to go through the ChemPath syllabus that's available on the CMSA website. Once you have your list of topics, I summarized the chapter from TEATS, and then I would use 2 to 3 key review articles to add additional points that weren't covered in TEATS. In terms of how much studying I did at home, the majority of my studying was done at home. It's good to have a study timetable because you want to be prepared in terms of knowing, today I'm going to do non-fatty liver disease, tomorrow I'm going to do cardiac markers, so you have an idea of how to plan yourself. But it's always important to be realistic with your time allocation. Don't expect to do cardiac markers in 20 minutes when you haven't ever gone through it before. For the first year before the FCPath exam, so this is sort of starting as year 3 as a registrar, I spent about 1 to 2 hours Monday to Friday studying, and I'd use the weekend to catch up if I'd missed any of those hours. Sort of 9 months before the exams, I extended that period to 2 to 3 hours Monday to Friday with weekend catch up again. After 6 months, I extended those hours again to around 4 hours every day, and almost every weekend studying. So 3 months, it went up to about 6 hours nightly, and I wasn't doing much else in the weekend besides studying, if I wasn't on call. The parts of chemical pathology of the syllabus that I found difficult in terms of preparing for the FCPath exam was methods, and it probably was more difficult for me because of the sort of the initial unfamiliarity with the subject. I wasn't from a BSc background. I had only done a year of chemistry in med school and high school physics, so some of the concepts and the principles were a bit more foreign to me. However, I found that going through the theory using the methods that we use for routine diagnostic testing within the lab I worked in helped to make the concepts and principles less abstract and easier to understand what was happening in that methodology. The other section that I found difficult, and I still am not the most comfortable with, is inborn errors of metabolism. And again, the easiest way to learn inborn errors of metabolism is that if you actually have a case, to read and learn around the case that you have, because that's the best way of remembering the disease. And again, I focused and made summaries on approaches. So I would write up an essay on approach to investigation of lactic acidosis, on approach to hyperammonemia, and then have summaries on the more common disorders. With regards to how much priority I give to research, the time I was lucky enough to be in a department where time was allocated during our registrarship to spend on our MEd project. So during the end of my first year and the first month of my second year, I spent collecting, processing my samples, and generated my data, and I was ready to ready for write-up for after I finished my FCP exams. It is difficult to manage your time to try to do research and get your poster presentations and your conference presentations, but it's important that you try to do this. In terms of how I dealt with case studies, I found the best way is that when you're signing out a result, you go through the process of what are the likely, for example, if you sign out a high potassium, you go through the processes in terms of what are the likely causes generally in a patient. In this patient, given the clinical history, what are the causes, what interferences would result in this falsely high value if it's high, or a falsely low value, how is this analyte measured, and what are the problems with the measurement of this analyte, and the clinical consequences of this high result. Again, you can use your case presentations that you present in your seminars to practice in terms of how you would interpret case studies. You can use the case presentations that others give in those seminars to see how you would interpret the case. You could go through case studies in various textbooks, and I mentioned a few of them at the beginning of this talk. In terms of calculations, again, it's practice, practice, practice. The more you do calculations, the better you get at them. And the more you go through, the more different examples you go through, the better you get. I used to like doing calculations, so for me, I actually use it as a break from studying. And it was more relaxing to do. Everyone uses Alan Deacon's Calculations in Laboratory Science. Get the book, and you basically go through the book over and over again until the book falls apart. As I mentioned, the ACP newsletter also has calculations from Deacon's Challenge. You can go onto the website, download all the questions and the answers, and then go through at least one a day whilst you're studying. Obviously more towards the end. Important thing is know how to use your calculator functions, your scientific calculator functions, and practice regularly on the calculator, so when you go into the exam, it's not the first time that you're trying to do these functions on the calculator. And the more you practice, the quicker you'll be able to enter data, and the quicker you'll be able to answer your questions in the exams. In terms of how I dealt with laboratory practical training, first thing to do is to spend time on the benches in the lab, so you know your test methods, know how the instruments work, know how to do some basics, be able to run a sample, make dilutions, do calculations with things like HPLC. For me, working on my MEd really helped me a lot in terms of my laboratory practical work. I did a lot of DNA extraction. I ran my own PCRs, made up my own agarose gels. I did my own preparation of my samples for LCMS. I worked with the scientists there to actually run my own samples, prepare my own QCs, run my own standard curves. So this was a very good experience in terms of preparing for lab practical work. You should just talk to your department, and it's very helpful if they set up a few practical conditions during the course of the year, so you can work under exam conditions, just so you know how to plan yourself out during your practicals. You can set up your own practicals. We did so with some of the other regs that were writing at the same time as us. We asked for a space in the lab, we were given an old spec, old pH meter, old glassware, and so forth. And we go there in our free time and practice certain practicals. So the next topic is a difficult one, in terms of how do you deal with social and domestic pressures. I guess coming into the course, you never really understand how demanding it can be. It's only when you're sort of in the midst of it then you realize it can be a lot tougher than many of the other specialities. So it's important to make your family and friends understand that these exams can be all consuming, and you're gonna have to be selfish with your time on lots of occasions in terms of keeping your study blocks for studying and not picking up someone from the airport. Having a supportive family makes things a lot easier. You can rely on them to do lots of the everyday things that you don't have time to do anymore because you're studying. For me, I was lucky in terms of that I didn't have any other responsibilities except studying. So it was a lot easier to manage. I didn't have a kid or any other sort of responsibilities. In terms of whether I have any unique personal strategies for studying, as I mentioned before, I studied from summaries. So once I made my summaries, unless I wanted to check something, I didn't really go back to the textbook, and I sort of limited the amount of reviews I was going to use to make my summaries. You can always add on information to your summaries so that they are more complete. But I preferred learning from summaries. I preferred writing things down to help me remember. The other thing that is of use and that I found is you can test yourself by going through past exam papers, and this you should do actually under exam conditions. Don't have any books open. Time yourself, write out the essay, and then give it to someone senior to review and mark, so that you can get some feedback in terms of your essay structure, your content, and if you are writing enough to pass that question. I found that I cannot study in front of a PC or laptop because I may go to look up something chem-path related, and then I'd be an hour on YouTube looking at cute puppies or something. Not. Some other advice is that you need to make sure you have enough sleep at all times, and do have some relaxation time. Try to attend as many clinics and ward rounds as you can. Again, I'm going to emphasize, once you associate a topic with an actual patient case, it makes it a lot easier to remember the theory around the topic.